The morning started like any other, calm, predictable, and routine. I sat at the breakfast table with my coffee, the sunlight filtering through the kitchen window, painting warm streaks across the room. It was one of those mornings where you could almost forget the cracks forming beneath the surface of what used to feel like a solid life. Almost. Laura was across from me, stirring her tea absently while her eyes darted over the local paper. Her expression was neutral, maybe even peaceful, but I'd spent enough time with her to know the difference between peace and distance. This was the latter. She hadn't looked at me properly in weeks. The subtle energy that once lingered between us, the unspoken understanding we shared, had been replaced with silence. Not an angry silence, just empty. To my right was Megan, her 18-year-old daughter. She was glued to her phone as usual, scrolling through whatever social media platform dominated her attention that day. Her face wore that trademark look of disinterest that teenagers seem to have perfected, like nothing in the world could possibly be worth their time. Except for her phone, of course. Occasionally, the screen's glow would reflect in her eyes, and she'd smirk at something, probably a meme or a text from a friend. Not once did she look up. The only sounds in the room were the clinking of utensils, the rustle of the newspaper, and the occasional beep from Megan's phone. If there was a soundtrack to my life, this would be it. Mundane, repetitive, and quietly frustrating. 5 years. That's how long Laura and I had been married. 5 years since I stepped into a life I knew would be challenging, especially with Megan in the picture. Laura had made it clear early on. Megan came first. I understood that. I wasn't here to replace her father, Ethan. God knows I'd never want to. Ethan was a walking disaster, a man who left scars, both visible and invisible, on Laura's life. He was her ex-husband, an abusive alcoholic who had spent years tearing her down before she finally found the courage to leave. He wasn't just a bad memory. He was a shadow that lingered in our marriage, whether we acknowledged it or not. I wasn't blind to what I was stepping into. When Laura and I met at a mutual friend's dinner party, she was still reeling from her divorce. Neither of us wanted to be at that party, but somehow, amidst the awkward small talk and forced laughter, we found each other. It was her laugh that drew me in, soft but genuine, like she'd forgotten how to let it out fully. And when she listened, she really listened. That night, for the first time in a long while, I felt seen. We dated for a year before tying the knot, and Megan came as part of the package. Being a stepfather is no walk in the park. Megan was polite, sure, but polite in the way you're polite to a stranger who helps you carry your groceries. There was a wall between us, one I could never climb, no matter how hard I tried. She never saw me as more than Mom's husband, and honestly, I stopped trying to change that. I figured my role was to provide, to care, and to be a stable presence in their lives. I did my best, even if it sometimes felt like I was swimming against the tide. This morning was no different. Laura's tea stirred, Megan's phone scrolled, and I sipped my coffee, pretending everything was fine. But things weren't fine. They hadn't been for months. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when the shift happened, but it was there. A growing distance between Laura and me. The warmth we once shared, the effortless way we used to connect, was gone. Conversations had dwindled to the essentials: schedules, bills, dinner plans. Intimacy was rare, almost mechanical. And her phone, God, the phone, it was always in her hand. Her eyes glued to the screen like it held the answers to questions she wouldn't ask me. I wasn't an idiot. I noticed the way she put it away when I walked into the room, how her tone shifted when she got a text she didn't want me to hear. These were red flags, bright and undeniable. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was stress, or something I'd done wrong. I even made excuses for her. Maybe she was tired. Maybe it was just a phase. But deep down, I knew better. You don't live with someone for 5 years without learning the subtle shifts in their behavior. Laura was hiding something. Megan's phone beeped again, pulling me out of my thoughts. She smirked at the screen, then glanced up, catching my eye for half a second before looking away. It was a small thing, but it stung. I'd poured so much into this family, into building a life for them, and yet, here I was, a stranger in my own home. As I sat there, pretending everything was normal, a thought crept into my mind. What if this wasn't just a rough patch? What if the distance wasn't accidental but intentional? The idea settled in my chest like a weight, uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. I looked at Laura one more time, her eyes still glued to the newspaper, her tea untouched. Something was wrong. I didn't know what it was yet, but I was going to find out. If there's one thing life teaches you, it's that the truth doesn't hide well, not for long. It has a way of bubbling to the surface, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. I didn't know what Laura was hiding yet, but the signs were there. The little things that started as whispers in the back of my mind had become a constant hum, a noise I couldn't ignore anymore. It began with her phone. I used to tease her about being glued to it, but now it felt different. It wasn't the kind of distracted attachment everyone seems to have to their devices these days. No, this was deliberate, clandestine. She would pick it up every time it buzzed, angling the screen away from me as if she didn't want me to catch a glimpse. Sometimes she'd leave the room entirely, whispering into the phone with her back turned, and when I walked in, the conversation would stop abruptly. She'd smile at me, too brightly, and ask if I needed anything. It was forced, too forced. Her excuses began piling up. Nights out with friends I'd never heard of before. Work emergencies that conveniently required her to stay late. Even at home, she seemed to be 1,000 miles away. When I tried to start a conversation, her responses were clipped, her attention elsewhere. It was like talking to a ghost, someone who was physically present but emotionally absent. And then there was the distance, literal and figurative. Intimacy between us had dwindled to nothing. At first, I blamed myself. Was I doing enough? Was I being the husband she needed me to be? But the harder I tried, the colder she became. She was always too tired, or not in the mood. The excuses felt rehearsed, like lines from a poorly written play. One night, I asked her directly, "Laura, is everything okay? You seem distant." She gave me a small, tired smile and replied, "I'm just stressed, David. Work has been a lot lately." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But there was something in her eyes, something she couldn't quite hide. It wasn't stress. It was guilt. The turning point came one Friday evening. Laura had said she was meeting a friend for dinner, someone she claimed I didn't know. Megan was out with her own friends, leaving me alone in the house. Normally, I would have spent the evening watching a game or tinkering in the garage, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. Out of curiosity, or maybe desperation, I called her phone around 9 p.m. It went straight to voicemail. No ring, no explanation. I told myself it was probably just bad reception or a dead battery, but the pit in my stomach told a different story, a darker one. When she finally came home after midnight, her hair was tousled, and her cheeks were flushed. She smiled at me as she walked through the door, setting her purse on the counter as if everything was perfectly normal. "How was dinner?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Good," she replied, too quickly. "We had a lot to catch up on." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push. But I noticed her phone tucked away in her purse, its screen dark and silent. Usually, she'd be scrolling through it the second she walked in the door, but tonight she avoided it entirely. That was when I knew for sure something was wrong. Still, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it really was work stress. Maybe I was reading too much into things. But then the dreams started. I would wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, visions of Laura and another man swirling in my mind. I'd look over at her, sleeping peacefully beside me, and wonder if the nightmares were closer to reality than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just her behavior that was changing. Megan's attitude shifted too. She became more defiant, more vocal in her disdain for me. Every comment she made felt like a jab, a reminder that I wasn't her father and never would be. Normally, Laura would step in, smoothing things over, but now she stayed silent. It was as if she was encouraging Megan's hostility, letting her do the dirty work. The final straw came when I overheard a snippet of conversation between the two of them. They were in the kitchen, whispering, but I caught enough to know I wasn't imagining things. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Megan asked. "What if he finds out?" Laura's voice was low, firm. "He won't. Trust me." I didn't confront her right then. I wasn't ready, not yet. I needed answers, real ones, not the half-truths she would undoubtedly feed me. And so, for the first time in our marriage, I did something I'd never imagined myself doing. I hired a private investigator. It wasn't an easy decision. It felt like crossing a line, betraying her trust in a way. But then I reminded myself that trust was a two-way street, and Laura had already swerved off course. I handed over $2,000 to the investigator, hoping that what I learned would bring clarity, even if it wasn't the clarity I wanted. As I handed him the cash, I told myself this wasn't about catching her in a lie. It was about understanding what had gone so wrong, about knowing whether the life I'd built with her was worth saving, or whether it had already crumbled beyond repair. When the investigator called me 3 days later, his voice was calm, almost detached. "I've got your answers, Mr. Wilson. You might want to sit down for this." And just like that, my world changed. It's strange how life can shift in the span of a single phone call. When the private investigator rang, I wasn't sure if I was ready for what he'd uncovered. But I knew I couldn't live in ignorance any longer. I answered, my voice steady even though my hands trembled. "Mr. Carter, I've got everything you asked for," he began, his tone neutral, professional. "I'll send over the files, but there's one thing you should know before you see them." "Go on," I said, gripping the edge of my desk. "It's not just any man," he said carefully. "It's her ex-husband, Ethan." Ethan. The name hit me like a fist to the gut. Of all the possibilities, I hadn't expected that. The man who had once made Laura's life a living hell, the man she swore she'd left in the past, was back. And not just back. He was the man she was sneaking around to see. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind raced, trying to piece it all together. Why him? Why now? She'd told me so many times how much she hated him, how he'd broken her in ways she didn't think she'd ever recover from. And yet, here we were. "I'll send the files to your email," the investigator continued, breaking the silence. "Photos, timestamps, locations. Everything's there." I thanked him, my voice hollow, and hung up. For a while, I just sat there, staring at my phone, dreading what I'd see. But I couldn't avoid it forever. I opened my laptop, logged into my email, and there it was, an email with the subject line, "Confidential, investigation findings." The photos were the first thing I saw. Grainy, but clear enough to be undeniable. Laura and Ethan, laughing together at a cafe, sitting too close on a park bench, entering a motel room late at night. There was no mistaking the intimacy between them, the way she looked at him. It was the kind of look she hadn't given me in years. The timestamps told their own story. This wasn't a one-time thing. It had been going on for weeks, maybe months. Each photo, each date and time, was a dagger to the heart. But the worst part wasn't the photos or the timestamps. It was the realization that she'd chosen him, the man who had once destroyed her, over me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, replaying every moment of our marriage in my mind, searching for the point where things went wrong. Was it something I'd done? Something I hadn't done? Or was this just who she was all along? The answers didn't come, but the anger did. Anger at Ethan for worming his way back into her life. Anger at Laura for letting him. And anger at myself for not seeing it sooner. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront her with the evidence just yet. I needed to hear it from her, directly. I wanted to see if she'd lie to my face, if she'd try to gaslight me into thinking I was imagining things. I wanted to see if there was even a shred of honesty left in her. That day, I sat at the breakfast table as usual, sipping my coffee while Laura read the paper and Megan scrolled through her phone. Everything felt painfully normal, as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis the night before. But I knew what was coming. I could feel it in the way Laura kept glancing at me, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. Finally, she set the paper down and looked at me, her lips pressed together, her eyes avoiding mine. "David," she began, her voice unusually soft, "I have something to tell you." I set my coffee mug down carefully, keeping my expression neutral. "Go ahead," I said, my tone calm, almost inviting. She hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I'll be out for a while. A month, actually." "A month?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Where are you going?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. To Ethan's. It's his birthday month and I want to be there for him, to make it special. For a moment, I didn't respond. I just stared at her, letting the words sink in. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady but cold. So, you're leaving your husband for a month to go play house with your ex-husband? Is that what you're telling me? Her face hardened. It's not like that. I'm not cheating on you, David. I'm telling you up front, so it's not cheating. The absurdity of her logic was almost laughable. Almost. So let me get this straight, I said, leaning forward slightly. You're going to clean his house, cook his food, and share his bed. But because you're telling me about it, it's not cheating? Her jaw tightened. Don't twist my words. Twist your words. I echoed, my voice rising slightly. Laura, you're abandoning our marriage for a man who used to beat you. A man who tore you apart. And you expect me to just sit here and be okay with that? She glared at me, defiant. I have desires, David. Needs that you can't fulfill. The words cut deeper than I thought they would, but I kept my composure. And what about my desires, Laura? Do they matter at all to you? Her response was cold, dismissive. Do whatever you want, David. Just remember, when I come back, you'll be my husband again. I leaned back in my chair, a bitter laugh escaping me. And what if I don't want to come back to this? What if I find someone better? Her eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across her face. But she didn't respond. Megan, however, smirked and chimed in, Mom's not your property, David. She's free to do what she wants. That was when it hit me. Megan wasn't just a bystander in this. She was complicit. She knew. She'd known all along. I stood up, my hands steady even though my heart was racing. Fine, I said evenly. You want to leave? Go. But let's make this official. 30 days of separation. No financial support. No obligations. You do what you want, and I'll do the same. Laura's smile was smug, confident. She thought she'd won. She had no idea what was coming. The pen scratched across the paper as Laura signed her name, her hands steady and her expression smug. She barely glanced at the documents in front of her, as though this was just another box to tick on her path to what she believed was freedom. Megan sat beside her, arms crossed, radiating the same air of defiance. It was like watching a mother-daughter team lock arms and march toward a cliff, completely oblivious to the drop. I sat across from them, my face calm, neutral, betraying nothing. Inside, though, I was a storm. Anger, betrayal, a quiet kind of satisfaction that the plan was unfolding exactly as I wanted it to. That's it, my lawyer said, his tone professional as he gathered the papers. Mrs. Carter, you've agreed to a 30-day separation during which Mr. Carter is released from any financial or personal obligations toward you or your daughter. You're free to make your own decisions, as is he. Laura nodded, a flicker of impatience crossing her face. Yes, I understand, she said. Her voice had that clipped tone she used when she thought she was in control, like she was humoring the rest of us. Megan, ever the loyal supporter, shot me a smirk. Well, at least you're being reasonable for once, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. This is probably the most useful thing you've done for Mom. I could have responded. God knows I wanted to, but I bit my tongue. Megan wasn't worth the energy. She was a product of her mother's bitterness, molded into a mirror image of Laura's entitlement and disdain. If anything, I pitied her. As we left the lawyer's office, Laura's mood seemed lighter. She walked with a spring in her step, like she'd just shed a weight she'd been carrying for years. Megan, ever the echo of her mother, strutted beside her, her smugness almost tangible. Thank you for understanding, David, Laura said as we reached the car. Her tone was saccharine, almost mockingly sweet. I'll make this up to you when I get back. I promise. I looked at her, studying her face, searching for any trace of the woman I'd once fallen in love with. But she wasn't there. This woman in front of me, the one so willing to dismantle our marriage for a man who had once destroyed her, was a stranger. Don't worry about it, I replied evenly. I've already made my peace with this. Her smile faltered for just a second, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She probably thought she'd won, that she had everything under control. She had no idea. That evening, I watched her pack. She moved around the bedroom with an energy I hadn't seen in months, humming softly to herself as she folded clothes and carefully arranged them in her suitcase. Every now and then, she'd glance at me, as if expecting me to say something, to plead with her to stay. But I didn't. I just sat there, silent, watching. "Do you need anything before I go?" she asked, pausing to look at me. Her tone was light, almost casual, as if she were heading out on a business trip instead of moving in with her ex-husband for a month. I shook my head. "No, Laura. I've got everything I need." She smiled, clearly satisfied with my response, and went back to packing. When she was finally done, she zipped up her suitcase with a flourish and turned to face me. "Well, I guess this is it," she said, her voice tinged with a forced cheerfulness. "I'll see you in a month." "Have a good time," I replied, my tone calm, detached. "I hope you get everything you're looking for." Her smile widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes. But it wasn't enough to make her stop. She picked up her suitcase, kissed Megan on the cheek, and walked out the door without a second glance. Megan followed shortly after, throwing me one last disdainful look before slamming the door behind her. The house was silent now, the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where Laura's suitcase had been, the faint echo of her footsteps still ringing in my ears. But I wasn't sad. I wasn't heartbroken. I was free. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a drink. The whiskey burned as it slid down my throat, a comforting warmth that steadied my nerves. This was the beginning of the end, and I intended to see it through. Laura thought she'd won. She thought she'd manipulated me into giving her the freedom to chase her twisted version of happiness. But what she didn't realize was that every step she took away from me was a step closer to the trap I'd carefully set. I wasn't going to fight her. I wasn't going to beg her to stay, or try to make her see reason. No, I was going to let her go, let her dig her own grave, and when the time came, I'd bury her in it. Figuratively speaking, of course. The next morning, I made the call to my lawyer. "It's done," I told him. "Make sure everything is in place. I don't want any loose ends." He assured me it would be handled, and I hung up, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back now. That evening, I stood by the window, watching as Laura and Megan drove away. I didn't wave. I didn't say goodbye. I just stood there, silent, letting the moment burn itself into my memory. They thought they were walking into a new chapter of their lives. What they didn't realize was that I'd already written the ending. When the door clicked shut and their car pulled out of the driveway, I stood by the window, watching the taillights fade into the distance. There was no relief, no immediate sense of freedom, just a cold, quiet stillness that crept into the house, wrapping itself around me like a blanket. It was unsettling and liberating all at once. For the first time in years, I was alone, not just physically but emotionally untethered. Laura and Megan were gone, their laughter, arguments, and subtle judgments no longer filling the air. The house, which once felt crowded and suffocating, now felt expansive. Too expansive, perhaps. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light as it swirled in the glass. This was the first drink I'd had in weeks, and it tasted different now. Sharper, more significant, as though marking the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. I sat in the quiet living room, sipping slowly, thinking about what I'd just done and what I was about to do. Laura thought she had won. She believed she was in control, walking away from our marriage with her head held high, her dignity intact. Megan thought the same, following her mother with that same smug defiance she'd perfected over the years. But neither of them knew what was coming. They thought this was their story, but it wasn't. It was mine. The first step in my plan was simple. Reclaim what was mine. The car I'd bought for Megan, a shiny little sedan she loved to flaunt to her friends, was the first to go. I'd been paying for it, after all. Why should it stay in the hands of someone who had made it her mission to undermine me at every turn? The repossession company arrived the morning after they left. I didn't bother watching the car get towed. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee as the faint sound of a tow truck rumbled in the background. I imagined Megan's face when she realized her precious car was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of public transportation or her father's unreliable old junker. The thought brought a flicker of satisfaction. Next, I turned my attention to Laura's car. Hers was the one she truly adored, a sleek SUV she'd always referred to as her baby. Well, it wasn't her baby anymore. The dealership had no problem taking it back when I explained the situation. By the end of the day, both cars were gone, leaving 2 empty spaces in the driveway. But the cars were just the beginning. The real prize was the money. Laura had no idea how much I'd quietly saved over the years, building a safety net she'd never bothered to ask about. It was ironic, really. She'd always assumed I was just a simple man, predictable and straightforward. She never once suspected I could be calculating when pushed. The joint accounts were the next to go. I drained them entirely, funneling every penny into an offshore account I'd set up months ago, just in case. Megan's college fund? Gone. The savings account Laura used for her little shopping sprees? Empty. I didn't touch anything that wasn't mine, of course. That was the beauty of it. Everything I took was something I'd put in, money I'd earned through long hours and sleepless nights. If they wanted to cry foul, they'd have to face the fact that they were only losing what I'd given them in the first place. By the time the 3rd day rolled around, the house was practically unrecognizable. The cars were gone. The accounts were empty. Even some of the furniture, a few pieces I'd bought for our home, had been sold to a local dealer. The house still stood, but it felt hollow, stripped of the life and energy it once held. And yet, amidst all the chaos I was creating, I felt calm. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I wasn't reacting to their choices. I was making my own. I wasn't the passive, accommodating husband anymore. I was the man I'd forgotten how to be, the man who could take control of his life without apology. Then came the final touch, my plane ticket. I'd been considering a move for a while, long before this mess began. A job offer in Bangkok had been sitting on my desk for months, waiting for a decision. It had seemed impossible at the time, a distant dream I'd never have the courage to pursue. But now it was the perfect escape. The ticket was booked, my bags were packed, and my resignation letter was ready to send. In 2 days, I would be gone, leaving behind the wreckage Laura and Megan had so willingly created. They wouldn't find me when they returned. They wouldn't even know where to start looking. That evening, as I sat on the couch with my whiskey in hand, my phone buzzed. It was Laura. Her voice was cheerful, almost giddy. "Hi, David. Just checking in. Everything okay at home?" I couldn't help but laugh, a low, bitter sound. "Oh, everything's fine," I replied, my tone calm. "Just taking care of some things while you're gone." "Good," she said, clearly pleased with herself. "I'm glad you're being so understanding. I knew you'd come around." "Of course," I said, the smallest smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "Anything for you, Laura?" She had no idea what was waiting for her. No idea that when she came back, everything she'd taken for granted, her home, her lifestyle, her security, would be gone. As I ended the call, I felt a strange sense of peace. This wasn't revenge. Not really. It was justice, plain and simple. And justice, as they say, is best served cold. It didn't take long for the phone calls to start. The first one came 3 days after Laura and Megan had left. I let it ring, watching her name flash on the screen as I leaned back in my chair, sipping a whiskey that tasted even better than usual. She called again, and again. By the 5th call, I finally answered, my tone calm, almost indifferent. "Hello, Laura." Her voice was sharp, the kind of sharp that comes from panic dressed up as anger. "David, what the hell is going on? Where's Megan's car?" "Oh, that?" I said, feigning mild surprise. "I had it repossessed. It's not like she needs it right now, and frankly, I didn't feel like paying for something I wasn't using." "You repossessed her car?" Her voice wavered between disbelief and fury. "That's her car, David." "Technically, it's mine," I corrected. "The title was in my name. Funny how that works." She didn't respond immediately, but I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end, the sound of someone trying to steady themselves before their emotions take over. I gave her the space to stew in it. I wanted her to feel every second of this. "In the joint account?" she snapped after a long pause. "Why is it empty? Where's the money?" "Ah, the money," I said, letting out a low chuckle. "Well, I've been using it. You know, taking care of my desires, as you so graciously encouraged me to do." "You emptied everything?" Her voice cracked, her composure beginning to fray. "Megan's college fund, David. That was her future." "No," I said, my tone suddenly colder. "That was my money. Money I worked hard for while you two treated me like a walking ATM. Megan's future can be funded by her biological father now, don't you think?" There was a long, heavy silence on the other end. For a moment, I thought she might hang up, but then she came back, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. "You didn't have to do this, David. We could have worked something out." I let out a bitter laugh. "Worked something out? Laura, you walked out on me to live with your ex-husband. You didn't ask. You didn't compromise. You told me. And you know what? That's fine. You made your choice. I'm just making mine." "You're punishing us," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't fair." "Fair?" I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "You want to talk about fair? Let's talk about how fair it was for me to pour 5 years of my life into this family, only for you to run back to the man who broke you. Let's talk about how fair it was for Megan to treat me like garbage while I paid for her car, her college fund, her entire lifestyle. If you want fair, Laura, you're looking in the wrong place." She didn't respond immediately, and I could picture her standing there, clutching her phone, her face a mix of anger, disbelief, and something else. Fear, maybe, or regret. Either way, I didn't care anymore. "David," she said finally, her voice softer now, we need that money. Megan needs it." "Then you'd better hope Ethan is feeling generous," I said, my tone icy, "because you're not getting another cent from me." With that, I hung up. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was a silence I welcomed. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control, not just of my finances or my home, but of my life. The calls didn't stop, though. Laura tried every angle she could think of: anger, guilt, pleading. She even had Megan call me, her voice full of teenage indignation as she demanded answers. I listened to her rant for a few minutes before cutting her off. "Megan," I said evenly, "you've made it very clear that I'm not your father. And you know what? You're absolutely right. So don't call me again. Ask your real dad for help." She sputtered, trying to come up with a response, but I hung up before she could. I wasn't interested in hearing it. Not anymore. A week passed, and the calls began to dwindle. But then, on the 10th day, I got one last call from Laura. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "David," she began, her voice calmer now, almost defeated. "What do you want? Is this about revenge? Because if it is, congratulations. You've won. Are you happy now?" I leaned back in my chair, considering her words. Was I happy? Not entirely, but I was satisfied, and that was enough. "This isn't about revenge, Laura," I said finally. "This is about consequences. You made your choices, and now you're dealing with the fallout. I didn't create this mess, you did." She was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What are we supposed to do?" "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but that's not my problem anymore. Good luck, Laura." I ended the call, and this time, I knew it was the last. There would be no more pleading, no more anger, no more manipulation. Laura and Megan had made their bed. Now it was time for them to lie in it. As I sat there, staring out the window at the quiet street, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. This was their realization, their moment of reckoning. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel responsible for fixing it. The courtroom was colder than I expected, both literally and metaphorically. It smelled faintly of old wood and paper, and the faint hum of murmurs from other proceedings echoed through the halls. I sat at my table, my lawyer beside me, a man as sharp as the tailored suit he wore. Across the aisle sat Laura and her lawyer, with Megan sitting behind them, glaring at me like a teenager who'd just been grounded for life. Laura looked composed, too composed. She had that air about her, the kind she always wore when she believed she was about to get her way. But I could see the tension in her jaw, the subtle clenching of her hands in her lap. She was putting on a show, trying to project confidence, but I knew her better than that. I knew she was scared. The judge, an older man with a weary expression, shuffled through the papers in front of him. He looked up briefly, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Laura. "Mrs. Carter, do you confirm you've reviewed the terms of this legal separation with your attorney?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady but clipped. "And you understand that during this 30-day period, your husband was not financially responsible for you or your daughter, and you were free to pursue your own personal choices without interference from him?" She nodded. "Yes, I understand." The judge turned his gaze to me. "Mr. Carter, do you agree that this separation period was mutually agreed upon and documented as such?" I nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." My lawyer cleared his throat and stood. "If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to bring a key piece of evidence to the court's attention." "Proceed," the judge said, leaning back slightly in his chair. My lawyer approached the bench, handing over a folder with several documents and photographs. These images, along with their timestamps and location data, confirm that Mrs. Carter was engaging in a romantic relationship with her ex-husband, Ethan Parker, prior to the agreed-upon separation period. This constitutes infidelity. Laura's face paled. Her lawyer stood quickly. "Your Honor, my client disputes this claim. She informed Mr. Carter of her intentions and had his tacit approval." My lawyer didn't even flinch. "Your Honor, the evidence shows that this relationship began weeks before any such agreement was made. Furthermore, we have text messages between Mrs. Carter and Mr. Parker that clearly indicate she was concealing this relationship from my client." The judge flipped through the folder, his expression growing more serious with each page. "Mrs. Carter, is this true? Were you involved with Mr. Parker before the separation agreement was signed?" Laura hesitated, her composure cracking for the first time. I wasn't hiding it. I just didn't think it was relevant." "Not relevant?" The judge's tone sharpened. "Mrs. Carter, infidelity is highly relevant in divorce proceedings. You misrepresented the nature of this separation to your husband and to this court." Laura's lawyer tried to regain control. "Your Honor, while my client's actions may be questionable, they do not negate her right to spousal support or financial compensation." My lawyer stepped in before the judge could respond. "Your Honor, Mrs. Carter willingly signed an agreement waiving financial support during the separation. Furthermore, Mr. Carter has provided evidence showing he spent the entirety of his personal funds on vacations and other expenses, leaving no assets for division." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're telling me there are no remaining funds to settle?" "That is correct," my lawyer said, his tone firm. "Every transaction is accounted for, and all expenditures were made legally during the agreed separation period. Additionally, my client has not adopted Mrs. Carter's daughter and is therefore not financially obligated to support her." Laura's lawyer looked like he was grasping at straws. "Your Honor, my client should not be left destitute. Mr. Carter clearly acted with the intent of leaving her with nothing." The judge held up a hand, silencing him. "While Mr. Carter's actions may seem calculated, they are within the bounds of the law. Mrs. Carter, you signed the agreement. You entered into this arrangement knowingly. And, frankly, the evidence of your infidelity undermines your claims for spousal support." Laura's face twisted in a mix of anger and disbelief. Megan sat behind her, whispering furiously, her eyes darting between me and the judge. I didn't need to hear the words to know what she was saying. She was blaming me, of course. In her eyes, I was the villain in her little fairy tale. The judge sighed, clearly weary of the drama unfolding before him. "I see no grounds to award spousal support in this case. Furthermore, any claims to joint assets are nullified by the agreement signed by both parties. The divorce is granted, effective immediately." Laura's lawyer tried one last time. "Your Honor, what about child support? Surely Mr. Carter has a responsibility to contribute to Megan's education." My lawyer stepped forward, his tone firm but calm. "Your Honor, Megan is not Mr. Carter's biological or legal daughter. He has no obligation to support her financially. This is well documented. The judge nodded, looking directly at Laura. I understand this may be a difficult outcome for you, Mrs. Carter, but the law is clear. This court cannot enforce obligations where none legally exist. And just like that, it was over. The gavel came down, a sound that echoed through the courtroom like a final nail in the coffin of our marriage. As I left the courtroom, I glanced back at Laura one last time. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. Megan sat beside her, glaring at me with all the defiance of a teenager who thought the world owed her something. They looked defeated, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. They had played their game, and I had won. The silence after the divorce was deafening. Not the kind of silence that soothes or brings peace, but the kind that presses against your chest and reminds you of what's been lost. Or, in Laura's case, what's been thrown away. I heard from mutual acquaintances that Laura and Megan had moved in with Ethan shortly after the court proceedings. It didn't surprise me. Where else could they go? They must have thought life with Ethan would be some kind of reunion, rekindling of whatever toxic bond they'd once shared. I could only imagine the initial joy they might have felt, settling into his small, dilapidated home. It must have felt cozy at first, the three of them playing house, pretending the world outside didn't exist. But reality has a way of catching up, and for Laura and Megan, it did so quicker than they probably anticipated. Ethan was never a man of stability. When Laura first told me about him years ago, she painted him as a monster. Angry, abusive, unpredictable. Yet here she was, willingly returning to the same man who had broken her in every way imaginable. Maybe she thought he'd changed. Maybe she thought she could fix him. Or maybe she just didn't care anymore. Either way, it wasn't long before the cracks began to show. I heard snippets through the grapevine. Ethan's drinking hadn't stopped. If anything, it had worsened. He'd never been able to hold a steady job, and whatever savings he had, if he had any, were quickly drained. He was erratic, prone to bursts of anger that left Laura scrambling to appease him. Megan, once so smug and defiant, was now just a silent witness to the chaos. The girl who used to strut around with an air of superiority was now taking the bus to school, her confidence replaced by shame. The luxuries they'd taken for granted, the car, the college fund, the financial security I had provided, were gone, replaced by long walks, secondhand clothes, and the kind of instability that Ethan excelled at delivering. Megan, who once rolled her eyes at every word I said, now had to rely on Ethan for everything. I wondered how long it would take her to realize that the man she idolized wasn't the savior she thought he was. As for Laura, she was trapped in the same cycle she had once fought so hard to escape. Ethan's drunken rages returned with a vengeance, and I could imagine her sitting in their tiny living room, staring at the peeling wallpaper, wondering how it had come to this. She had chosen this life, after all. She had walked away from stability, from safety, from me. And now, she was paying the price. The irony wasn't lost on me. Laura had always accused me of being too predictable, too boring. She wanted excitement, passion, and unpredictability. Well, she got it. But excitement doesn't pay the bills. Passion doesn't provide security. And unpredictability? That's just another word for chaos. One day, I got a call from a mutual friend, a woman named Sarah who had always been more loyal to Laura than to me. She hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether she should even be calling me. I just thought you should know, she began, her voice quiet. Things aren't going well for Laura and Megan. I didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch out until she continued. Ethan's well. He's the same as he always was. Drinking, yelling, you know how it is. Megan's not handling it well. Laura's trying, I guess, but you can only try so much when someone like Ethan's involved. There was a pause, and then she added, she made a mistake, David. I think she knows that now. It was an odd feeling, hearing those words. There was a time when I would have wanted to hear them, when I would have wanted some kind of validation that I'd been right all along. But now? Now they just felt hollow. Thanks for letting me know, I said finally. But it's not my problem anymore. Sarah sighed. a sound heavy with disappointment, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as I did that Laura had made her bed. Now she had to lie in it. Weeks turned into months, and the updates became less frequent. I stopped answering the calls altogether. It wasn't that I didn't care. I did, in a way. But I'd spent enough of my life trying to fix Laura's problems, and I wasn't about to start again. She had chosen Ethan. She had chosen this life, and she would have to live with the consequences of that choice. Megan, for all her arrogance and entitlement, was now learning a harsh lesson about life. I couldn't say I felt sorry for her, not entirely. She had been old enough to know better, to understand the difference between right and wrong. And yet, she had sided with her mother, supported her every step of the way. Now she was stuck in the same sinking ship, powerless to stop it from going under. As for me, I moved on. Literally. My new job in Bangkok was everything I'd hoped it would be: challenging, rewarding, and far removed from the chaos I'd left behind. The city itself was a whirlwind of activity, a place where I could lose myself in the noise and never look back. Sometimes, late at night, I would think about Laura and Megan, about the life we'd shared and the choices they'd made. I wondered if they ever thought about me, if they regretted the way things had turned out. But those thoughts never lingered for long. There was no point dwelling on the past. The future was waiting, and I intended to embrace it fully. Laura's new reality was harsh, but it was hers. And for the first time in years, I was finally free of it. The plane touched down in Bangkok on a humid evening, the lights of the city stretching out like a sprawling maze of possibilities. As I stepped off the plane and into this new chapter of my life, I felt an unfamiliar sense of relief. It wasn't just the distance from Laura and Megan, though that was part of it. It was the realization that I was finally free. Free from the weight of a marriage that had turned into a prison, free from the betrayal, the manipulation, and the lies. The job offer I'd been sitting on for months had come at the perfect time. Bangkok was bustling, chaotic, and alive in ways that my old life never had been. The company that hired me had been eager to bring me on, and I was more than ready to dive into work, lose myself in something productive, and rebuild what had been stripped away. As I settled into my new apartment, high above the noise and traffic of the city, I reflected on everything that had led me here. Laura's smugness when she signed the separation agreement, Megan's defiance as she stood by her mother's side, the look on Laura's face in the courtroom when the judge handed down the final ruling. Those moments played in my mind like scenes from a movie, vivid and sharp. And then there was the last move I made before leaving. I'd instructed my lawyer to deliver a parting gift to Laura the day after I left the country, a manila envelope handed to her by a process server outside what was once our home. Inside were the finalized divorce papers and a letter outlining everything she had lost. It wasn't just the financial security she'd taken for granted. It was the stability, the safety, and the partnership I had offered her. The letter wasn't angry. It was factual, clinical even. I wanted her to understand, in no uncertain terms, that every consequence she was now facing was a direct result of her own choices. I didn't need her apology. I didn't even need her regret. All I needed was for her to see the truth. I'd be lying if I said I didn't wonder how she reacted when she opened that envelope. Did she cry? Did she scream? Did she try to rationalize it, convince herself that she hadn't been the one at fault? I would never know, and I was okay with that. My chapter with Laura and Megan was closed, sealed, and done. In Bangkok, I began to rebuild, not just financially but emotionally. The job was demanding, but it kept me focused. The city was alive with opportunities, distractions, and a kind of vibrancy I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself, not for someone else's expectations or needs. The silence from Laura and Megan was telling. I hadn't heard from them since the divorce was finalized. I could only imagine what their life with Ethan had become. The toxic cycle they'd willingly stepped into was now their reality, and I had no intention of saving them from it. They had made their bed, and they could lie in it. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, sipping a cold beer and watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky, I allowed myself a moment to reflect, not on Laura or Megan specifically, but on the lessons their betrayal had taught me. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be the good guy, the provider, the protector, the fixer. I thought if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, loved enough, I could hold everything together. But some people don't want to be saved. Some people will take everything you offer and still demand more, never realizing the value of what they've been given. In the end, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Laura or Megan pay for what they'd done. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my sense of self. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. And now, as I looked out over the city that had become my new home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Sometimes life doesn't give you closure. Sometimes you have to create it for yourself. I had done that, not with anger or bitterness, but with clarity and purpose. Laura and Megan were no longer my problem, and I was no longer theirs. The chapter was closed. The story was over. And for the first time in years, I was finally free to write a new one.